There is a field in southern Illinois, 11 miles east of St. Louis, where the largest prehistoric earthwork in North America sits beside a 4-lane highway and a discount retailer. I found it while looking for something else. I was tracing the proportions of 19th-century federal buildings, trying to understand why so many government structures from that era were scaled for people larger than the ones who supposedly used them. But the deeper I went into the survey records, the more I realized the buildings weren't the real story. The ground was. Because what the early surveyors documented doesn't match the history we've been taught. There is a field in southern Illinois, 11 miles east of St. Louis, where the largest prehistoric earthwork in North America sits beside a 4-lane highway and a discount retailer. I found it while looking for something else. I was tracing the proportions of 19th-century federal buildings, trying to understand why so many government structures from that era were scaled for people larger than the ones who supposedly used them. But the deeper I went into the survey records, the more I realized the buildings weren't the real story. The ground was. Because what the early surveyors documented doesn't match the history we've been taught. There is a survey drawing in the Smithsonian Institution's collections, made in 1848, of an earthwork in Ohio that no longer exists in the form it was measured. Ephraim George Squire and Edwin Hamilton Davis spent years documenting what they found across the eastern United States, measuring, sketching, recording alignments to the sun and moon. I came across their work while researching something adjacent, something smaller, and the further I read, the more a single question kept surfacing. If this is what they found in 1848, what had already been lost before they arrived, and what was lost in the 70 years after they put down their pencils? I was looking for architectural records when I found the mounds, not the mounds themselves, the paper trail around them, survey drawings from the 1840s, excavation reports from the 1880s, newspaper notices from Ohio county papers describing weekend parties where amateur diggers competed for the most unusual objects. What I found was not a mystery about a vanished civilization. It was a documented sequence: survey, extract, destroy, reclassify. Each step recorded by someone somewhere in careful 19th century handwriting. The record of the destruction is almost as complete as the destruction itself. Almost. Consider the math. An earthwork built in 1050 CE that survived intact until 1880 had already outlasted the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and every European cathedral then standing. A farmer born in 1840 who broke his first furrow through a mound at age 30 would have died, at 80, in 1920, his grandchildren inheriting land that showed no sign of what had been there. Those grandchildren are the last generation that carried any physical memory of the landscape before the clearing, and they are gone. Cahokia occupied a floodplain across the Mississippi River from present-day St. Louis. At its height, between 1050 and 1200 CE, it housed an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people within its core, and perhaps twice that number in surrounding settlements. London, in 1100 CE, held approximately 15,000 residents. Cahokia was not a village, it was not a camp, it was a city, organised around a ceremonial plaza larger than many European town centres, dominated by a tiered earthen pyramid that required the movement of an estimated 55 million cubic feet of soil, carried, basket by human hands. Cahokia was not an anomaly, it was a node. The Hopewell Interaction Sphere, flourishing roughly between 100 BCE and 500 CE, connected communities across the eastern half of the continent into a network of trade, ceremony and shared architectural language. Copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, mica from the Appalachians, all of it moving along routes that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the northern Great Lakes, centered on earthworks that took generations to complete. The Newark earthworks in Ohio enclosed 4 square miles and aligned to the 18-year lunar cycle. This was not accidental. This was a tradition of precision that had been accumulating for 2,000 years when Squire and Davis arrived with their measuring tapes in 1846. Their 1848 publication, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, the first volume ever issued by the newly founded Smithsonian Institution, documented over 200 distinct sites: walls, avenues, enclosures, effigy mounds shaped like birds and serpents and bears. Their measurements were careful. Their illustrations were precise. What they produced was the most comprehensive record of surviving earthworks in the eastern United States at exactly the moment that record became most necessary. But here's the detail that nobody discusses. The same decade that produced those surveys produced the first systematic wave of destruction. The 1840s were also the decade when developers were platting the land around the Newark earthworks into residential lots, when railway surveyors were cutting through burial complexes in Indiana without documentation, when the speculative land economy had begun treating every acre of flat ground as a resource waiting to be converted. Squire and Davis were measuring what remained. What remained was already a fraction of what had existed 50 years earlier. The documentation and the destruction ran in parallel from the beginning, and the destruction was faster. That mismatch between what the surveyors found and what the dominant narrative needed the land to contain would be resolved, not by correcting the narrative, by removing the evidence the narrative couldn't explain. The removal was not random. It had methods, and the methods had names. The most direct was the plow. Across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri, farmers broke earthworks into their fields across the 19th century, with no particular malice and no particular record-keeping. A mound that had survived 2,000 years of weather required on average 3 to 5 seasons of cultivation to disappear entirely into the topsoil. The process scattered artifacts, ceramic sherds, copper fragments, worked stone, through the turned earth, stripped of any context that might have explained what they meant or who had made them. By 1900, the majority of smaller earthworks in the agricultural Midwest had been eliminated this way, not by policy, by habit. But the larger destructions required deliberate effort, and the deliberate efforts left paper trails. The Sellers Mound in Chillicothe, Ohio, 40 feet high, documented by Squire and Davis in 1846, was excavated commercially in the 1890s, its contents sold to private collectors and museum acquisition agents who travelled the region with cash and wagons. The Turner Mound Group near Cincinnati, one of the most significant Hopewell ceremonial sites in the eastern United States, was excavated between 1882 and 1885 by the Peabody Museum of American Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University. The excavation removed thousands of objects. The site was left open, destabilized, and subsequently built over. The Peabody kept the artifacts. Ohio kept the whole. The looting economy operated in plain sight. Here's the detail that nobody discusses about it. The normalization was not incidental to the destruction. It was the mechanism. Newspaper coverage of mound excavations in the 1870s and 1880s described them as adventures, competitive and commercially promising. The Cincinnati Enquirer ran accounts of weekend parties where amateur diggers competed to find the most unusual objects. Auction. Notices for mound artifacts appeared in regional papers alongside listings for farm equipment. The objects moved from fields to parlours to dealers to institutions, each transfer adding a layer of legitimacy and removing another layer of origin. By the time a copper breastplate reached a museum display case, the community that had made it and the ceremony it had served were unreachable. The transfer was the point. This is where the Mound Builder myth becomes impossible to ignore. The myth held that the earthworks had not been built by the ancestors of living Native Americans at all, that they were the work of a vanished race, variously described as Phoenicians, Vikings, Israelites, or a lost white civilization destroyed by savage invaders. It was not fringe. Josiah Priest's American Antiquities, published in 1833, sold over 20,000 copies in its first 18 months, and argued for a pre-Columbian white civilization wiped out by the ancestors of the people Americans were currently dispossessing. Consider what that argument achieved. If the mounds had been built by a vanished race, then destroying them was archaeology, not desecration. Removing the objects was preservation, not theft. Dispossessing the land was recovery, not conquest. The myth was not a mistake, it was a solution. In 1894, Cyrus Thomas, working under the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institution, published his report on the mound explorations, a 12-year study of more than 2,000 sites. His conclusion was unambiguous. The earthworks had been built by the ancestors of living Native American peoples. The evidence was methodically documented. On scientific grounds, the myth was finished. The popular narrative did not notice. The vanished race story continued circulating in textbooks and general histories well into the 20th century. The correction existed in the scientific record. It simply never travelled the same distance as the original claim, and while the scientific argument was being settled in one direction, Federal land policy was accelerating in another. The Dawes Act of 1887 broke up collectively held tribal lands into individual allotments, a process that transferred approximately 90 million acres out of native ownership within 50 years. Mound sites on newly allotted or transferred land had no protected status. They had no legal standing as cultural heritage. They were parcels. The Bureau of Indian Affairs administered the allotment process. It kept no systematic record of what was destroyed in the course of it. Each transfer was individually documented. Together they formed something harder to dismiss than any single act of deliberate destruction. Not chaos, sequence. The academic gatekeeping was quieter than the plowing. It left fewer marks, but it lasted longer. Warren K. Moorhead was born in Synethsville, Ohio in 1866 and spent the next 5 decades excavating and documenting mound sites across the eastern United States. By the 1890s, he had begun writing publicly about the pace of destruction, not just from agriculture and development, but from the institutional excavations themselves, which removed objects without recording their precise context, leaving sites that could never be properly interpreted again. His 1910 report to the Ohio State Archaeological and Historical Society documented 37 significant sites in Ohio that had been partially or wholly destroyed since Squire and Davis had measured them in the 1840s. 37 sites in 60 years. He called it a catastrophe. The report was filed. The destruction continued. Here's the detail that nobody who covers the history of American archaeology discusses cleanly. Between the Antiquities Act of 1906, which gave the federal government authority over archaeological sites on public land, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, there was an 84-year period during which the legal framework for handling Native American remains treated those materials primarily as scientific resources. In practice, a 19th-century grave excavated from a mound in Ohio could be accessioned into a museum collection, catalogued, studied, and stored indefinitely, with no legal obligation to notify or consult the community whose ancestors had been buried there. The Smithsonian Institution alone held the remains of approximately 18,500 native individuals when NAGPRA passed. 18,500 people, removed from the earth, transported to Washington, catalogued by number. NAGPRA required consultation and repatriation. It came too late to address the majority of what had been taken, and too late to restore the sites from which it had been taken. But here is what the standard account of NAGPRA leaves out. The communities whose ancestors built the earthworks had not disappeared. That was the most persistent and consequential fiction, that the mound builders were severed from any living tradition, leaving their structures available for interpretation by whoever arrived with an institutional affiliation. The Muskogee Nation traces direct cultural continuity to the Mississippian mound-building tradition. The Osage Nation's oral history connects their ancestors to specific sites in the Missouri and Arkansas River valleys. The Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Potawatomi, nations whose territories overlapped with the most extensively documented earthwork complexes in the Midwest, were present throughout. They were consulted by no one. They watched their ancestral landscapes parcelled and built over across the same decades that academics debated whether the people who built those landscapes had constituted a civilization. Their engineering was attributed to a fantasy. Their testimony was not entered into the record. The timeline is not subtle when you lay it out as a sequence. The 1830s and 1840s, the first comprehensive surveys document what exists. The 1850s through 1900s, the agricultural and commercial destruction eliminates the majority of smaller sites. The looting economy strips the larger ones. The 1880s and 1890s, the Mound Builder Myth reaches peak circulation. The Dawes Act begins transferring millions of acres of culturally significant ground out of native ownership. 1894, Cyrus Thomas corrects the scientific record. The popular narrative ignores him. 1906, the Antiquities Act protects federal land but not private land, and not the remains already in institutional collections. 1990, NAGPRA passes, 84 years after the first federal protection law, and begins the slow work of returning what can still be returned. There is a woman, there had to have been in every county where the mounds once stood, who grew up hearing her grandmother describe what the land had looked like before the plowing, before the railway, before the development that turned earthworks into foundations, She carried that memory the way people carry things they have no institution to confirm for them. When she described what her grandmother remembered, she was describing an engineering tradition that had shaped the landscape of half a continent for 2,000 years. When she was not believed, it was not because the evidence was insufficient. It was because the institutions that held the evidence had decided, long before she spoke, what the evidence was allowed to mean. What remains is more than most people expect. The Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, 1,348 feet long, oriented to astronomical events, surviving because a private preservation effort purchased it in 1887, 1 year before a proposed development would have incorporated it into farmland. The Newark Earthworks, their original 4-square-mile extent now visible only in the Squire and Davis drawings of 1848. LIDAR surveys conducted across the American Southeast continue finding sites under forest canopy that no ground survey ever reached, entire complexes, invisible from the surface, waiting in the data. The archives do not forget. The Bureau of American Ethnology reports from the 1880s and 1890s are digitized and searchable. The survey drawings are reproducible. Tribal historic preservation offices hold oral histories that academic archaeology spent a century refusing to treat as evidence. The mounds that remain are outnumbered by the ones that don't. But the ones that don't are still in the record, in the measurements, in the handwriting of the people who saw them before the plows arrived. The same way evidence always survives, not in the landscape which can be cleared, in the documents, which are harder to lose than anyone intended.